Good morning, guys. So as we start social studies today, we're going to start introducing some new topics. Your POD for today was maybe kind of a hot button discussion question that we would be talking about in a current events class if we had that option in person. I did ask on the instructions to be mindful of other people's opinions, although they may be different than your own. You are still entitled to theirs as they are entitled to yours, or vice versa, I meant. But as we're looking at being respectful, maybe backing up your opinion with facts, we asked you to compare a little bit of what's going on today to the civil rights movement. You may see no comparisons whatsoever because we haven't gone over it very much. However, try to come up with a talking point or two if you can about what's going on in the world around you as we are currently living history. So, first thing I need you to do today is to open up your books to page 434 and 435. Good job, you're there. All right, so this is the road to the Civil War. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. So typically at the beginning of every chapter, we will spend some time talking about what we're going to learn about in the chapter. I've got a pretest for you over the Civil War that we will give you in a couple of lessons. However, first we're going to kind of dive into what led us to the Civil War. So, typically what we'll do, we'll read American history as well as interesting things in world history. We'll start with the top of the timeline. Get my writing tool out here. So typically I ask a student to read the first thing, what happened in United States history in 1845, and then somebody raised their hand because they're paying attention. Usually I call the person right next to them and they tell us that Texas became a state. So as we look at the United States expanding, this is one of the things that we are talking about in the 1840s. So while we're preparing for the Civil War, all of these things kind of led to the Civil War. So if we were in class, we'd kind of talk about how maybe that could have led us to the Civil War. The next thing in world history, since I think it's important, since many of you can trace your ancestors to Ireland, which we'll be doing at the end of the first quarter, the first thing we see there is a potato famine. Many people began to immigrate from Ireland during a potato blight. So blight is a fancy word for, hey, they didn't grow very well for whatever reason. And a lot of the population of Ireland were starving because potatoes were a staple of their diet. So they looked for freedom. They looked to come wherever they could to get a new start. And a lot of them came to the United States. In 1850, I'm not sure how well you can see this thing here because it's a little bit, I don't write very well, guys, sorry. 1850. Perfect. The Compromise of 1850 is passed. Now we're going to be talking about that in a little bit more detail. And again, another precursor during this chapter to what led us to the Civil War. So some of you just kind of had informational knowledge. Yeah, we had a Civil War. Many of your POD answers reflected that it was about slavery or states' rights. But how we broke down the states that were coming into the Union was one of the things that kind of led us up to that. The Communist Manifesto, which we'll talk about in another 100 years in history class, written by the father of communism, came up with this plan that would eliminate class struggles, would eliminate personal property, but also a governmental and type that's going to eliminate a lot of freedoms that we are accustomed to with democracy and social and our United States kind of breakdown. In 1852, our next item on the ticket here, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. So as we look at this book that kind of chronicles the lives of people who grew up in this era, it's going to kind of bring another highlight to what is driving us into the Civil War. On the next half of the page, sometimes we'll look at the picture, so let's do that first. I might say, hey, what do you see? So as we're looking about these pictures, it says about 425,000 African Americans in the United States were free, while 3.2 million lived in slavery. So one of the things I guess we have to understand with today's lesson is that there were some slaves that had either bought their freedom or were now out of slavery, while a great deal of the population were now still enslaved. So in 1850, that is kind of where our tipping point is, and some states would be slave states and some states would be free states. And we'd ask you, if you knew, hey, what states needed slaves the most? And we'd hope in class that we'd be able to negotiate and discuss and figure out that, well, they needed more slaves in the South, and then we look at their economies and decide that, well, they needed slaves in the South because those were going to be the more rural communities where farming was a big job. So they needed lots of hands. While in the North there was more industry, the South relied on a lot of slave labor. In 1854, on the bottom of the page, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. So while we're looking at all of these as we look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act in more detail in this chapter, kind of important as a new state was being added, their government had to decide whether they were going to be pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And thinking about Kansas, what we know about it today, what would you guys think? This is not Dora, but that's correct. They're maybe going to lean towards slavery because we know Kansas has a lot of farmland, so they may need these laborers. So while we're looking at pro-slavery, about 6,000 people actually crossed the border, even though 1,500 people lived in Kansas at the time. About 6,000 people voted in the election. Kind of like today we're worried about election fraud and voter fraud. Well, I guess this was a big thing. However, they elected a pro-slavery government in Kansas at the time for further kind of fueling the fire over what to do in future states as they were admitted to the Union. As we study the Dred Scott decision in 1857 in this chapter, we will kind of dive into what the Supreme Court of the United States said about slavery, noting that the Constitution said that we cannot take away a person's property, and slaves were considered to be just that. They didn't have their own freedoms guaranteed in the Constitution because they were slaves. So the Constitution at the time, according to the Supreme Court, actually supported slavery. So this further led to the divide in the country. As we think we're being progressive and getting over this, many abolitionists were fighting to end slavery, while the Supreme Court of the United States gave the pulse to the country at the time and said that slavery was constitutional. The next thing, in 1859, a raid on Harper's Ferry. As we look at October 16th, an abolitionist, a person who fights against slavery, as we would discuss in class, led 18 men, both whites and African American, on an arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia. So this is going to kind of take to light. If we're looking at civil rights movement or the current situation that we're in today, we see more militant action. And this was one of those things in 1859. In 1860, President Lincoln is elected president. So as we look at our history, we like to claim Lincoln as all our own, although he was born in Kentucky. The Illinois politician who was a lawyer in Springfield ran for president and was elected in 1860. And as we look at the quote from the page before, he says, "Slavery was a major cause of the worsening division between the North and the South in the period before the Civil War. But he says, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter to Hodges in 1864. So while we're looking at how Lincoln felt about this, the President of the United States would do his duties as he felt them to make sure that we were abiding by the Constitution. And ultimately, it would be under Lincoln that we fought the Civil War. Finally, the next year, we'll talk about secession and what actually led to the Civil War. So that's kind of how we will kind of break this down. So we'll break down individual lessons, be wary of an assignment that will be given over our first section is maybe our timeline also. However, that will not be due until tomorrow at 10 p.m. So have a great rest of the day. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you tomorrow. Eat them.